Okay, it's 3 minutes past. Shall we make a start?
That sounds good.
Julie, did you have any comments you wanted to make before we got started with the presentations?
No, so we'll share some information with you all in the chat in just a moment, just to give you all the logistical details for some of the practice sessions that you're about to hear, which are happening at ASHG. So we'll send that over shortly. But otherwise, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, great. So I think the schedule for today is let me just pull up my notes. So I'm going to run through just not the full presentation, but give a really brief overview of the landscape analysis presentation that we'll start with ASHG. Then Aoife is going to talk about the standard in more detail. Matt is going to present his benchmarking results. And then we will talk a bit more about so at ASHG, we're going to have an open discussion session. We've got some guiding questions that we've come up with to kind of stimulate discussion, but we're happy to take feedback on if anyone's got other suggestions of questions that we could ask there. And then Aoife is going to talk through the PEG list format that we sent the survey out earlier in the week. So I'm just going to share my slides. So yeah, the work that I'm going to present. Oh, can you see my slides or can you see my
See the
you see
presenter.
like a presenter view? I'll try swap display. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, awesome. Now something is looking odd with my. Do you
Yeah.
still
Oh,
see my slides okay?
yeah, but with the second one overlaid over the top.
Oh, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what I did. I clicked on something, it fixed it. Okay, so this the work that I'm going to present has mainly been done by Maria the Broad, but Maria's now retired, so we're not asking her to do a presentation at ASHG. So I'm going to present that work on behalf of us. So yeah, just to outline what we mean by effector gene prediction, the kind of data that we're talking about. And that it's an important output of GWAS studies, and it's key to defining gold standard loci and complex disease. But there's a lot of inconsistency. It's difficult to assess the validity of different methods that produce different results because there's missing data and no standard exists for the reporting. So just, yeah, then to talk a little bit about the current resource landscape that the GWAS catalogue would like to include PEG genes, but we don't at the moment. The knowledge portals and open targets also curate PEG lists, but this is an excessively manual and frustrating activity. So the goal for the activity is that we want to develop a fair PEG standard that works for the data resources and also for the community to enable data integration and reuse and generation of hypotheses. So yeah, we've defined gene prioritization as the activity that is carried out, and the PEG list as the sort of structured overview of the results. We did a landscape review of publications that included systematic gene prioritization. We found that there's definitely a growth in gene prioritization papers, that they typically start with identifying the causal variant and then either find evidence about the impact of the variant or start with the genes and find evidence directly about their function. And obviously, in the standard, we've divided that into gene-centric and variant-centric evidence. And there are many bioinformatic pipelines that are used to integrate the scores. We found that typically there were around 4 evidence categories per study, but it was very, very variable. That there was no single evidence type that was used universally. It's quite variable. And while 75% of papers actually integrated all the data together in a peg list, 25% of them had done this activity, but they hadn't tried to integrate the data in any way. So there was a lot of hunting around in the paper to try and synthesize that data.
Yeah, I'm leaving just a sec.
Um, So yeah, we also found that some peg lists are only presented as images with no underlying data at all. There's lots of differences in information content between the different presentations, whether they include all the genes per locus or only the top gene, whether they include a scoring system or no scoring system, so there's no indication of what the strength of the evidence is. It was very difficult to compare predictions for the same traits, even when they were done on the same GWAS, because of the difficulty in comparing the data and finding the evidence and the methods that had been used. So yeah, the conclusion is it's really the Wild West in PEG reporting. So we proposed some minimal standards for reporting. So the GWAS should be documented, the boundary coordinates of the loci should be defined. There should be enough metadata to describe how each evidence type was generated, the criteria for significance of the evidence type, and the scoring system used to categorize gene priority should be, well, firstly performed, but then also documented. Um, the data should always be presented as a single list, including all evidence types as a downloadable file, not as a graphical representation. Should include all the evidence for the genes that were considered at each locus, not just the single highest priority gene. Should indicate the sentinel variant, use standard nomenclature for gene names. And could take consideration in using automated pipelines, but also including the evidence that went into the automated pipeline as an independent observation. So then just talk about the timeline of the working groups. Obviously, everyone here knows what that is. And that then, we culminate in the ancillary session at ASHG. So that's what I am going to cover. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments, or I can hand over to Aoife. The next part. The floor is yours, Aoife, I think. I'm still sharing, so.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, so I'm going to be presenting the actual framework that we have come up with. We're not using the word straw man anymore, calling it a framework. And I want to introduce to you the name we've come up with. I hope no one has any significant problems with this because the poster is already printed. But the name that we've come up with for what we've been working on is the Pegasus framework for predicted effector gene reporting. It stands for Predicted Effector Gene Aggregation Standards and Unified Schema. So this is what we're going to be referring to our framework as. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because you are familiar with it, but just to show you how we're presenting it. And this is very reflective of the poster we're going to be presenting as well. So our goal is to create findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable predicted effector gene data to improve on the state of the landscape that Laura just described. But the ultimate long-term aim is to enable meta-analysis of that data to be able to define gold standard lists of genes that are involved in traits. And we're working towards a couple of different use cases: data integration and reuse to enable computational ingest, submission to knowledge bases like the portals or the GWAS catalog, and to support kind of an AI use case. Ultimately, to be able to facilitate research and hypothesis development. And we've talked about the considerations before that we have to balance the data quality, the fairness of the data, all the different factors that make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable, with the burden on the person who's creating the data, and then the need for data creation. So, and when we're coming up with a standard or a framework, we have to be careful not to overburden people with too many requirements, but we also want to make it useful. So we've created a GitHub repo for the standard, the framework, and we're drafting a load of documentation to describe it all, to describe what we're proposing. This is, you can go visit it now, but it is under active development and it is subject to change, but I encourage you to go and have a little explore about the how we're presenting this. And this also includes information on the working groups and the workshops and links to all of the slides and presentations that we've participated in. For those of you who won't be there, this is the poster that we're going to present the day before the ancillary session. I've got a link to that there for if you want to have a look at it later. But as Laura showed this already, it's very useful to think about the kind of data that we're dealing with and how we can wrangle that into a more fair format. So if we look at a toy data example with 2 loci, so this is for, say, a GWAS for myocardial infarction. We've got 2 loci, these are the lead variants, multiple genes distributed around there. A publication might display all sorts of different evidence types, but they might be distributed throughout the publication. And they may or may not provide some kind of integrative score like Laura was mentioning. So based on thinking about the kind of data that is out there and our analysis of the landscape and something that came out of the workshop, this is the basic framework that we're proposing, that we have defining the 3 kind of concepts that a PEG list, which is a high-level summary of the data, must be supported by an evidence matrix, and that both of them must be described by metadata. So these are the 3 like modules that are in the framework. So the metadata describes the trait and the provenance of the GWAS, the sources for all of the different evidence types, the descriptions for the methods used, and the definitions of the columns that are included in the data. Then we have the metadata, then the evidence matrix includes the evidence for all of the genes considered, not just the top genes, all of the different evidence types, and may include integrations. If it has an integration, an author's conclusion integration, it can be summarized into a list. That's a high-level summary, which lists the best predictions for the top genes. It indicates which evidence categories were included in the analysis, and it includes an author's conclusion, so some kind of integration. That's the basic, that's the kind of core of the framework. We require these to fit this framework, we require the data to be for 1 trait, applying to 1 GWAS that creates 1 matrix and then results in 1 list. The data is organized into different sections, first on the genomic identifiers that describes the variants, the loci, and the genes that are under investigation. The next section then describes the evidence, the different evidence streams that are included in the analysis, and these are assigned to categories. The categories we derived from the landscape analysis, and these are classified into either variant-centric or gene-centric categories, depending on whether the data relates to the variant or the gene. And then the next section is integration, which is description of how the different evidence streams are integrated. And these are represented in all of the different modules. So if we think about the toy data again, we would divide it up like this. The initial part describes the trait, the GWAS and the trait. Then we would have a section describing the variant and the gene and the locus, like this top section up here. The evidence then would be classified EQTL and LD categories and gene-centric categories. And then the bottom 2, which are about integrating the different evidence streams, is the integration section. So the metadata content, I won't go into it in great detail, but again, it describes all the different parts of the data. For example, for the variant, it would be something like the genome build, how the lead variant is, if it's a lead variant, a sentinel variant, or whatever other identity of the variant may be. For the locus, it would be like the methods used to define the locus boundaries. You know, is it plus or minus 10,000 kb from the lead variant, for example? And then, yeah, the evidence is divided into different streams and categorized, and should include all this information, and then the integration section. So this is just an example, a part of what the evidence schema would look like. So you can see that you have an evidence stream name, category, and then we've got kind of modularized source information and method information, and again the column headers. And again, this is just a little snippet. And we have a metadata example for the toy data. And again, if you go to the documentation, you can see a more full example, including the YAML representation of the metadata. So the things that I'm showing you are really the schema, and they can be represented in either YAML or JSON format, but we're just showing a YAML representation because that's more human readable. We've also created a metadata data entry template, because the metadata can be quite complex and challenging to create. So we've created a template to help people put the data in the right format. That's available to look at as well. The evidence, this is the contents of the actual evidence matrix. Again, it's divided into the same sections that you're familiar with by now. But this is where the actual data lies. This can be a very large table. Specifying the primary ID is of the variant ID. And then there'll be what locus that lies in, and what gene that relates to. And evidence and integration columns come after that. And we're suggesting that they are named using the initial abbreviation of the category, followed by whatever the user wants. And again, categories all need, the column headers all need to be defined in the metadata file. This is an example again for the toy data, what that would look like, just for the two loci. And we have come up with evidence categories, as I said, that are based on what we actually saw in publications when we did the landscape analysis, classified into variant-centric and gene-centric. Some of the types of evidence can apply to either genes or variants, and that's why they appear twice. The PEG list, what we're describing here is the foundational model for a PEG list. So a PEG list must be supported by an evidence matrix, and it's basically a summarization of the evidence matrix. And it, in this version, the foundational model records whether or not the evidence was considered. So if we have a tick here for each category, that means evidence was considered in that category for that gene. It doesn't speak to whether or not that evidence was positive or negative or the strength of it. It just indicates whether or not that evidence was included and therefore considered. And it the list will represent the top genes. We'll have a discussion later about what that means, but it's a much shorter list. And we suggest that future iterations can expand on this with more detailed annotations and structured scoring. But for now, this is what we're proposing as a foundational model for the PEG list. And it just gives users a very high level overview of what the top genes and underlying data was. So our conclusion is the framework facilitates submission to knowledge bases like knowledge portal and linkage to the GWAS catalog. It enhances the interpretability and enables interoperability of PEG data. Having standardized categories really helps that, standardized formats. And it lays the foundations for meta-analysis and generation of the gold standard effector lists. So that is basically what I will be, presenting. Oops, I'll stop there. I've got more slides for later. But I'm happy to take any questions. Nice name. Oh, thanks. Just saw the comments. Okay. I think we can hand over then to Matt. So we haven't really described a lot about what we did for the benchmarking activity. We can put in a little bit more context about that and about what the purpose of the activity was. But why don't you take it away, Matt? And
Sure. Okay. Do you see my screen?
it's good.
Looks good.
Great. Yeah, so I'm just going to describe a little bit of my experience with benchmarking the current the PEGLIST specification using some previous data. So just to kind of frame this challenge from my perspective, I'm part of a group that's involved in data generation, particularly chromatin atlases for connecting variants to gene through physical interactions, mostly thinking about it from a variant level, annotation level. And so I think having this format is really important for both data generators and tool developers, as it's very common that as we completely iterate through different data sets and tools, that we want to try to have a standard that we can make comparisons against. And so in particular, trying to establish a confluence of evidence for these GWAS predictions and identifying effector genes to do this. This should and it's important to increase exposure. So this is an example where we took one of our newer data sets and compared against a number of old data sets, seeing fairly limited overlap, which is partially due to differences in methodology, but also differences in the annotations we use, gene versions, etc. And so having consolidated documentation should really facilitate making these comparisons stronger. So for my benchmarking activity, the case study that I focused on was the POPs paper, where the general objective was to format the table and identify it in the metadata YAML in order to identify any issues. And so this paper generated a new algorithm at the time called POPs, and applied it to a number of different GWAS traits. The one that we focused on was age of menarche, and the GWAS was conducted using the UK Biobank from an analysis from the same lab. And so they generated their score, and then compared it to a number of different data types and methods for scoring, including chromatin interaction, ABC model, EQTLs, correlations across epigenetics like co-accessibility and distance to nearest gene. And so with these different data sets, it wasn't really just open them showing all the evidence against all the evidence. The variant to gene pairs for some fields like POPs or distance to nearest gene could have all the evidence available, while some of the other ones were constrained by other factors like this Javier promoter capture high C data was a constraint for most of the co-accessibility annotations. And some of the annotations could be quite sparse, especially things like protein coding, where there's a limited number of GWAS variants that are going to have a protein coding gene associated with them. And then for these, there were multiple columns associated, either measure of significance, rank within them, or sometimes just measures of, read count for the Jung promoter capture high C. And so for this activity, the reformatting the benchmarking data was fairly straightforward. That it was largely clean and put together. So the main emphasis for this was classifying the evidence into the established types by the standard. And so For that, it was mostly straightforward. I would say that there might have been a little bit of ambiguity at the time about whether for the gene start, the gene coordinates. But for the most part, for this list, it was fairly straightforward activity to assign those. But for building the YAML file, that was I used just R to build the list, build a list, and then convert to a YAML format. So pretty standard tools, pretty straightforward for doing that. I would say this part had more challenges in tracking down data as described. That most of the information was for this data was in prior methods papers. In particular, some of the data sets would be like not the wouldn't be the focus of the main paper, just something in the supplemental table, or in one case it was only on the developers lab website. Where the table had originated from and what criteria they'd used to generate it. So it may not have been that paper's primary product. And then there was a little bit of ambiguity for some of the information, such as assigning groups to some data was transformed so that it would be like the strongest contact for a number of variants within a credible set. And so it was a little unclear if those should be counted as variant-centric or gene-centric evidence. And so in terms of the time to build the table, my experience is pretty similar to GR Array Express submission. So for me, that's like about 3 half days. And then understanding the data filtering and inclusion within the tables presented took a significant amount of time. And then in addition with that, like I mentioned, tracking down the data sets and tools, but I think that this has an opportunity for pre-made annotations for really common resources that a lot of that can be made streamlined. So my overall, I guess, strengths and limitations I felt from my experience, I thought that the way that the evidence was being presented was strong for this data set, and it was format was flexible to account for all these differences in data sets where some might be nominating specific variants, others account for a signal labeled by a lead variant that you can annotate what you're talking about. And the metadata format was easy to work with since it had a consistent, it could be used with existing tools. And then for limitations, the one thing from my personal experience generating lists is that as you start to have combinations of annotations, like multiple cell types, the size of the list can get pretty untractable, but summarizing that into a list can definitely save that. And then ambiguity with data transformations. So in some cases, they would have only report the strongest association across the number of cell types tested, or aggregate number of variants and only report the strongest result. And so having, I guess, like a little bit to differentiate the cell type agnostic versus specific approaches, I think would be a useful addition. And then with that, some of the metadata, I think, might need additional requirements for labeling, such as things like chromatin capture is really sensitive to resolution being called. So including maybe some more specific levels called with that. But as you increase the number of requirements, that's going to result in, I guess, a larger burden for the people generating these lists. And so I think that by combining these data together, it'll enhance finding and reusing results, so that when you're generating your next iteration of the list, that you'll be able to make comparisons to figure out what's novel, what's well supported with previous data. Having this formatted table will definitely help with ingestion for, I think, both of the major stakeholders. And I think having all this centralized is very critical because it's much easier to find results in the portal compared to searching across multiple papers. And so, in summary, I think from my experience, I think the flexible format will definitely improve reporting of variant to gene predictions. And I thought that the time taken was reasonable overall. And then with a few modifications and maybe pre-made annotations available would be able to further streamline the results. And with that, I'd like to thank the members of PEG working group, the organizers, and then Strong Grant and Andrew Wells are my employers. Thanks.
That was really great. Yeah, I really like the suggestion about providing pre-made annotations of the common resources. I think if you can give us the examples that you've got in your data, I mean, I know they're in there, but yeah, if you could maybe highlight those for us, that could be really useful.
So just highlight like pre-made annotations like G tags and
Yeah, like what you think would be useful, the main ones that you think would be useful.
okay. Okay. Specific annotations. Okay.
Aoife, Julie, did you have any comments, questions?
No, Julie.
Oh, I agree with Laura. I thought it was fantastic. I guess I'm just thinking back to our other benchmarking presenters, and if there are any other, big themes or big components that we could potentially, weave into your presentation based on others' experience. I know, I think some of our benchmarkers are here, right? Does anybody else have thoughts on that particular?
I think the thing that comes immediately to mind, and I think you touched on a little bit, Matt, is the issue of separating out the curatorial task of dealing with somebody else's data from the framework in itself, because a lot of the problems are trying to like find out what exactly they did and what method did they actually use. Where you'd imagine if you did it yourself, you should know a bit better. But so I think that might be, and I think that came across in multiple of the other benchmarkers too. So it might be nice to highlight that.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with one. I want to highlight because Matt was not here, was not available for the last session, and we talk about many things for the benchmarking. It's very difficult to curate a paper because we are not data generator. We do not have full data from them. So yeah, that is the common limitations for when we do the benchmarking. I think overall I really like the presentation, and I really appreciate your highlights to say as a data generators, you want to this late can improve the data exposure in the future. So based on that point, do you think the current schema can help with that, or do you have an idea on it?
Yeah, I think the current schema helps a lot with it. Just having like all the, I guess, resources together to.
Yeah, because it bring to my idea that like I'm thinking to say if we have a standard filter in we have everyone like the more and more people using the our standard in the future, and they can easily find, for example, like the chromatin annotations one. And for right now, you can only based on, oh, this paper is really popular. I know that one. I can use that one, reuse that one. But in the future, like when we have more standard things, people can more easy to curate the most accurate or most suitable one for their open trace. And that one can be, not only improve the data exposure, but like also can help people select the accurate data for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's your idea or opinion on it. Yeah, it came to my mind. Overall, I really appreciate your presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree that yeah, the Javier paper, for example, I think is the most common one used, but for age of the trait that we were looking at, the like different immune and blood cell types is probably not the most accurate one to use for that one. Of course, this paper was looking across multiple different traits.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's more like a methodology paper. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh, Abdurrahman had a message in a question in the chat about using R to generate the metadata. It says, I'm curious of how you used R for the list. Was the list data sourced by R through some automation?
So I did not source through automation. I had just generated the list and then used the YAML package to write the list. So yeah, you could define like probably like the format and like have it be added kind of automatically with your table, but that'd be probably the way to do it instead of going that route.
Yeah, and I think that came up in the previous session that some tooling would be really helpful
Yeah.
to encourage people to generate the data in this format. Okay, I'm just conscious of time. I think we should move on, but thank you so much, Matt. That was fantastic. I just have one very quick slide with the questions on. Oh, thank you. So yeah, this is after we've presented the standard and then we want to give people examples of the lists in their kind of original format and the reformatted according to the standard. And so the sort of starting questions we'd come up with is firstly, encourage people to think about how they could apply the standard to their own data. And secondly, think about how they could be helped to reuse other people's data. So some general questions were, are there any evidence categories missing? Does the standard include all the metadata you need to reuse the data? Think about when you would use the list rather than the data matrix and vice versa. What other use cases for PEG data that you have and how we can incentivize adoption of the standard. So if anyone has any other suggestions for discussion questions, if you can pop them in the chat, that would be really great. Otherwise, I am going to stop sharing and hand back to Aoife to talk about the lists.
Yeah, some other questions might come into your head as I
Yeah,
because I have as we've been putting all of this together, other questions have come into our head, and we've been doubting ourselves on some questions, so we thought we'd just air them, and get your thoughts. And even if you don't have comments on them now, you can share them offline or any other point. But so the big one is about the PEG list. So we've said that the big one is about the PEG list. I'll get into that. We've got some other smaller other questions that relate more broadly to evidence categories, column header naming, and variant as a primary ID. But we'll see how far we get. The big one is about the PEG list. So we've defined this framework that really didn't exist formally in the landscape, but until we kind of got into this, right? This isn't the distinction between an evidence matrix and a list wasn't really formalized. We saw that when we were doing the landscape analysis and looking at all this different data, that sometimes some were evidence matrices, but didn't really have conclusions. Some were lists that they didn't have the supporting data. So we made this distinction between the evidence matrix and the list. So the evidence matrix has all of the data, and then the list is the distillation with the top genes. And you can see that the use cases are a bit different for that. If you just want to know what the top gene is, you look at the list. If you want to dig more into the data, do reanalysis, you look at the evidence matrix. And we say that in the framework that a list must have an underlying evidence matrix. The list is derived from the evidence matrix. So the question is then, which genes make it onto the list, basically? And this is an important question. So we've said they're top genes, but what do we mean by a top gene? And this, if you want a little bit more to revisit this again, this is in the survey that we sent out to you guys last week. So when we presented this at the last working group meeting, we hadn't really thought it through as much as we have now. And we raised the possibility of that the presented data that makes it onto the list is about having well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. What genes make it onto the list, right? Sorry. There's two different questions here, and I've presented the first one the other way around. So there's the what genes make it onto the list, but then also how do we show what evidence is included in that list, in that gene that makes it onto the list. In the previous meeting, we talked about potentially having thresholds applying for all the different evidence categories, but we've since realized that it's just not tractable at this point. So the presented data that makes it onto the list is limited just to whether or not the evidence category was included in the analysis. That's what I mentioned before. And that they must include one conclusion integration column, and that's how that is what determines whether or not the gene is top. So the foundational model that we're proposing just records whether or not the evidence was included. So that's one thing. But what counts as a top gene? So if we look at our toy example, you've got your two loci, and you've got an author conclusion that integrates all of the different evidence streams. You could do this two ways. So option one would be that the top gene per locus is included on the list. So in the toy example here, that would be gene number 1 for locus 1, because it's the one with the strongest evidence. For locus 2, that would be gene 4, because it's the one with the strongest evidence. That's what we mean by a top gene per locus. So the pegged list from this evidence matrix would be gene 1 and gene 4. The other option is that only genes which pass a certain threshold, which might be set by the author or determined by the author, would make it onto the list. So in this example, only gene 1, because that's the only one with strong evidence, makes it onto the list. So those are our two options for how we would derive, two main options for how we would derive an peg list from an evidence matrix. This is what it would look like in a rendering. So this would be for option 2, both genes make it onto it. Option 1 is just the first one makes it onto the list. So that's one question. There's advantages and disadvantages of both. Obviously, having a simple filter that just chooses the top gene is the most straightforward way, but the downside then is that that's not very flexible, and then you lose some of the author's input, but it's standard. The downside to option 2 is having an author determined thing means that it is not standard, and it will be less clear potentially the rationale for why a gene would make it onto the list. I think we are leaning towards option 1 because that is the simplest implementation at this time, but we're very happy to take your thoughts. And we're very happy to take them offline as well. Because there's other considerations. If 2 genes are tied as a top gene, how do we handle that? We would propose in this model to allow both genes onto the list. We also think that at this stage, more sophisticated handling of missing values, distinguishing between absent data or negative data, is beyond the scope of this foundational model, and that is something that could be considered in the future. So that's our core question at the moment: top gene per locus, or have some kind of thresholding mechanism.
Is it worth mentioning as well that in the POPs paper, which I think is the same paper that Matt presented, they actually proposed that it's better to define a top gene per locus rather than genes passing a global threshold.
Yeah, was that the POPs paper? Or was that it was the POPs paper? Yes.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what analysis they did to arrive to that conclusion, but yeah. So I think what we're leaning towards in this for this foundational model is that it would be top gene per locus.
Actually, like I was thinking, maybe I start from one question from me that I'm thinking about like so we're showing the locus and at least there is one gene is moderate, but what if for the locus all the genes are weak?
Yep.
So we still want the better one for that locus.
That
Or
is a good question. Yeah, and how that would be implemented if all genes at the locus are equally weak.
yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be somehow, thinking about combining option one or option two to say I don't know.
Yeah.
You think like for the locus, like at least the top gene is moderate, for example, it'd be some combination.
But again, I mean, in this example, we have strong, weak, moderate. That's what the author has provided. It could be equally a numerical value. So the interpretation of that numerical value could be more challenging for a downstream user.
True.
But yeah, I think it's subject to more discussion. But
Yeah, that might be something where we have to leave it to the author's discretion.
Yeah.
Whether they consider something that has weak evidence to be worth reporting.
And then how to implement that and make it transparent. Yeah. So that's the big question. There are other smaller questions that kind of came back to us as we were going through these things. We would really appreciate and Matt and the other benchmarkers have looked at this, but we would really appreciate more eyes on the evidence categories to assess their suitability. As we were putting together the documentation, we found a couple of errors that we had made, which we've fixed, but it would be really great to get some people to have a look at these evidence categories and assess how suitable, future-proof, etc. they might be. So that is one appeal. In particular, some of the evidence categories, as we had proposed them, actually include specification of the mode in the category. Now, what I mean by this is, so in the metadata for the evidence and in the integration, we have a field called mode, and that is about the author telling us whether this evidence or this integration was derived through a human curated method, through a computational one, or mixed. So for example, for the integration one is probably the easiest one to think about. If you have a list that's all human curated, you would just add curated. If your integration was done with POPs, that would be computational. And then if you did some kind of assessment after considering both the POP score plus the human curated stuff, that would be mixed. So that's what we mean about the mode. It's like how that was derived. We noticed when we were going through the categories, as I said, that in some of the categories, we had specified that the data in the category is human curated. So the example here is the literature. So this is if you go to the literature, you pull out some information that you include as evidence. We've specified that it's human curated, but that kind of contravenes this. We have that piece of information in both places. And it is possible nowadays that literature curation could be done in a computational way if it was done with an AI agent or text mining or something like that. So this is an example of something that's in the categories that we now think we should change this. We should remove the human curated aspect from the category definition and rely on the mode that's specified in the metadata. Any thoughts on that at this time? Again, think on it. Another thing that we're also going back to consider is the column header naming. So in our framework, we've suggested that the column headers in the evidence matrix are named in such a way to make it clear to a human reader what evidence category they pertain to. So as Matt described, when you have the different evidence streams, we ask you to categorize them into the different evidence categories. And that is made, that is something that appears in the metadata. So the question is this requirement to also include that information in matrix column headers, is that useful? Because it does aid human readability, but is that really the audience for the matrix file? And or is it too burdensome on an author to do this? Like where does the balance lie? So the question is, should we continue to suggest people include column header abbreviations, category abbreviations in the column headers, or do we rely just on the metadata file for categorization information? Any thoughts on that? It may seem like a small point, but we do need to consider the burden we're putting on the author with regard to uptake.
Sorry, Aoife, just to make sure that I've understood that properly. So for in this example that you've got up there, so you've got EQTL aorta p-value and then EQTL aorta confidence interval with Q appended with QTL on the front.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the alternative to that is to just put the EQTL aorta.
Yes. So
and then in the metadata for EQTL aorta evidence, it would be categorized as QTL.
Correct. And similarly for LD, the LD would be removed off the front. For here, the perturb, because that's our category abbreviation for perturbation, that would be removed from the beginning of the column headers. I should have shown the two versions here. Yeah, so it will be not immediately clear when you're looking at the matrix, evidence matrix file, which categories the columns relate to. Although computationally, that will be it will all be there. It's in the metadata file.
Is there not a risk that you'd have duplicate columns, like that one that was perturb mouse? It would just be mouse. And
again, yeah, that's another consideration that you'd have to maybe do some validations to avoid duplicate columns. Yeah.
I suppose that I would ask Matt that question. Did you find it cumbersome having to add those categories onto the column headers, or was it helpful to keep track of things?
I think it's helpful to keep for keeping track of it. And then like a lot of times we work with experimental lists, and I think that type of information is really useful for them.
Yeah. Yeah, so that there is an advantage with human readability. Yeah, for sure. Okay. That's useful feedback. One other consideration, when we were looking through different example data sets for benchmarking, we specified that the variant is the primary row ID in our matrix file. And we've said that that's a mandatory field. But the question is, should we allow gene as the primary ID and say the variant is optional? So this would facilitate, for example, gene-based GWAS analyses that are presented without a lead variant. Or should we stick to our guns and say, no, you have to have some kind of variant ID as the primary identifier? Because this framework is for post-GWAS analysis. That is another question. Is that clear what the question is?
I think like if it's burden analysis, you'd still need to at least have criteria for like what variants get included in your burden analysis. So I think that even if you just make some type of ID to represent.
Yeah, again, so this is one of these things where, we came across these data sets that didn't have a primary ID, a variant ID, but we kind of feel that the author should be able to derive one. So the data should still be able to be represented with a variant ID. Yeah, we thought we should at least raise the possibility. But anyway, those are the kind of some of the things that we are considering, and that it's been useful to go back over them again. If anyone has additional thoughts on them, we'd be happy to hear them. I think we'll probably discuss some of them at the ancillary session. That is all I have for today.
Okay, so we're nearly at the top of the hour. Julie, did you have anything you wanted to add before we finish up?
Yeah, I think we're in good shape. Just please distribute that link to anyone you know in your circles. We really appreciate everybody's work on this working group. I know it's been, over the course of months that you all have attended and participated, and we want to distribute these as widely as we can. So thank you all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're really looking forward to the ancillary session next week. I think there was one last thing we wanted to mention was that we have included the names of everyone from the working group on the working group website. So everyone's who's been attended these meetings. If you've got any concerns about your name being mentioned there, please let us know. But we want to give recognition for everybody who's given their time to the project. Okay, and on that note, I think we can say goodbye. Thanks everyone for your input, and yeah, be speaking to some of you soon.
And
Thank
we
you.
will report back for those of you who can.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. All right, cheers. Bye.
Everybody.
Yeah.